In today's video, we're going to work on trying to find the correct cartridge overall length for our hand loads. Today's video is going to focus on the process put forth by Eric Cortina in his Chasing the Lands is Stupid video. The main focus of today's video is going to be finding the jam point, the problems that I ran into, and how I overcame them. Stick around. To begin today, I want to be very clear. Today's video is all about learning how to tune cartridge overall length so we can achieve the best groups possible. This is not a video trying to tell you how to do your load development. If you're happy with the results you're getting, I'm never going to tell you that you have to change. If your way is already perfect, use it. This is in no way telling you that Eric's process does or doesn't work. We're simply going to cover my experience starting off with it, the problems that I had, yes, I did have an issue, and how I ended up overcoming it to accomplish my task. I welcome anyone that's had an issue and come up with a solution to it to post them in the comment section below, just so we can help the community out. Now, initially this video is going to be walking through the entire process. I had my plans all laid out, and then as it so often does, life happened and I ran into a snag. Instead of using the first 10 minutes of the video to talk about the problem that I had, I'm hoping to just publish that video next week. In this week's video, we're going to explain what happened, how I overcame it, and how that might help you. I don't want this video to scare anyone away. In fact, for simplicity's sake, you can actually just skip this entire process of finding jam and load to magazine length, assuming that's not too long for your application, or at least just start with a dimension that you know is safe for your application and work backwards from there. Once you know that starting dimension, shortening your dimension in 3,000 increments is all your test entails. In my case, I can't possibly do anything the easy way. I'd like to tinker way too much. And by hook or crook, I was going to figure out how to do this exactly the way he talked about in the video. In case you're not familiar, the first step is to actually find jam, which is the primary subject of today's video. In his video, he defines 3 areas. Jam, which is essentially where the projectile sticks in the barrel. In the lands, so where the projectile is touching the barrel but not stuck. And jump, where the projectile is not touching the lands at all. Now, jam is a spot that we want to avoid, so we don't end up sticking a projectile in the lands and ruining our day. The actual first thing that I had to decide was a projectile that I wanted to use to test. And I initially picked the 143 grain ELDX. This projectile has never really performed well for me, and I thought this test might just be the ticket to finally make this load behave. To find jam, we're actually supposed to take a piece of brass that has been prepped just like our standard process, which for me is an annealing, a full-length sizing with the expansion device removed, and the use of an expander mandrel that's 0.02 under the caliber dimension, which for this case is 6.5 Creedmoor, so a 0.262 inch mandrel through the case net to set my neck tension. Now, an upfront warning for today. For those that enjoy distracting from the conversation, I will be referring to neck tension in reference to the expander that I use to open the case mouse. I do understand that brass springs back after it's sized and that thousandths is probably not the correct measurement for neck tension. I am sure that there are more correct terms to use and a better way to measure it. However, it will have no effect on the understanding of the issue and how we moved forward from this step. That out of the way, one of the things that Eric tells us about jam is that it is neck tension dependent. I thought this was a very interesting concept and something I wanted to explore. How dependent is it? If I end up making a slight change to our neck tension, do I need to worry about it? If you're anything like me, you always wonder these things, and I know that you'd want to know too. So I pulled out my expander mandrel kit from 21st Century Reloading, and I decided to check our neck tension in 0.5 thousandths increments. These sets actually go above the 0.264 projectile diameter, so they're going to allow us to explore a very wide range, or at least I thought. One thing Eric is adamant about is not actually needing to know the distance to the lands. However, I'd actually measured all these for a previous video, so I actually had a chart with all the projectiles that I had on hand and knowing my distance to the lands. If you're anything like me, you probably know these dimensions for the projectiles that you use as well. So I do have one more piece of information that you might not have, but probably don't need. In my book, more information is better, but it may just be distracting from the point of what we really need to understand. So instead of prepping just one piece of brass initially, I started with 4. What can I say? I just like to make life more difficult for myself. I really wanted to understand how neck tension dependent this particular measurement really is. Since Eric recommended backing the seating die out 50 thousandths from the 2.27 inch dimension that I already knew, so I added 50 thousandths and started off at 2.330 inches. So I seated my projectile on my heaviest neck tension, applied my die wax, and a long story being too long, I actually got the projectile stuck in the barrel, and I ended up having to knock it out with my cleaning rod. Not exactly how I wanted to start out my day. Getting that projectile stuck was very frustrating, and this is where I seriously thought about going to secret option number 2, picking my known safe distance and starting from there. And I really don't think there's anything wrong with that. I'm not one to give up easy, so I thought, let's try and work with something I know has worked well for me and see if we can improve upon it. One thing that also crossed my mind in one of Eric's other videos, he mentioned he was using very light neck tension. He doesn't say what it was, just light. I immediately switched to 140 grain ELDM, which I've had good luck with. I've already been able to achieve a couple half MOA groups, so I thought this guy might be a better example anyway. Nothing says we can't go back and test the 143 later if we wanted to. Besides switching projectiles, I also decided to start on the opposite side of the neck tension spectrum. My previously known distance to the lands was a CBTO of 2.222 inches, and this time I started off with a neck tension set with my .2645 mandrel. This worked perfectly without sticking, and I got a jam measurement of 2.2335 inches. Next, I used a piece of brass that the neck tension was set with the .2640 mandrel, and immediately the CBTO tested went to 2.264 inches. Again, no sticking and no issues at all. Being brave, we went to the .2635, and again, easy peasy. Ended up with a jam of .2660 inches. Pushing my luck again, I went to the .2630 mandrel, and it got just a touch longer with a CBTO jam point measurement of 2.270 inches, just 4 thousandths longer. Since it was working, I decided I would push my luck again and try the .2625 mandrel. This seemed to be the neck tension setting where I was getting difficulty getting a measurement and where I really felt the bolt was working too hard to actually seat the projectile further into the case. So this is where we stopped. However, the data we have I think shows a good range depending on how you choose to reload. Even though it's slightly less neck tension than I normally load with, I do think that it showed that using even less neck tension, we were able to come up with a jam point of 2.270 inches, and backing that off puts us at 2.250 inches. This should be, and I will confirm is from the testing that I've done, seems to be a safe distance where I continue to load into the chamber and eject without having any fear of the projectile being stuck where we don't want it. The only caveat to that is that if you are using less neck tension than that, you are going to want to find the jam point with the neck tension you're using. Now, with our newly found method, I thought I would go back to the 143, being a little bit cautious, but see what actually happened. Being a little bit shy this time about having to knock out another projectile, I started off at a looser setting just to see what would happen. In this particular case, I actually started off with a 265 expander. In this value, the neck tension was so low that I could easily move the projectile with my fingers, but again, we just wanted to get a number. The measurement that I had taken with my Hornady modified case was a CBTO of 2.227 inches. Interestingly enough, with our first case at 265, that was the exact jam that we measured, 2.227 inches. Moving to the .2645 mandrel, that our dimension moved to 2.232 inches. At .264 mandrel, we ended up with 2.250 inches. With our 2.635 mandrel, we ended up with a jam CBTO of 2.255 inches. Now, as far as measurements for the 143, that is where I stopped. Probably if I repeat this test with the 143 ELDX, I will end up going and try and get that dimension at .263 inches, but I thought I'd use enough brass at this point, and I was certainly tired of dealing with stuck projectiles. One other option that I thought I would look at is knowing Eric's fondness for burger, that I would see with some burgers that I had in stock to see what dimension I could get with them. So we turned to the 144 grain hybrid target. My initial testing with this projectile didn't really look so good, so I've actually never bothered to share it with anyone, but I thought maybe all it needs is a good cartridge overall length tune. The problem you will see here though is if you look at the chart, you will see the touch measurement is 2.245 inches, which leaves it at a cartridge overall length of 2.934 inches. This made for a very interesting test, as when I closed the bolt and ended up having to actually start trying to remove the dummy round, I actually couldn't get it to eject the round without removing the bolt. This is going to be a perfect example of when we actually need to start at magazine length and move backwards from there, because loading to such a ridiculous cartridge overall length is not going to allow us to eject a cartridge that hasn't been fired. So all that drama just to get this test started. Now for the 140 grain ELDM, we're actually going to start out with a max CBTO of 2.250 inches. That's 20 thousandths off the max dimension we got of the 2.270 inch jam measured with the .263 inch mandrel. We're going to be starting there, moving that dimension shorter 3 thousandths increments at a time, and we're actually going to shoot 16 different groups, which just happens to be the target that's behind me right now. The information from that target is what I hope to be sharing with you next week, but I really wanted to make a dedicated video for those of you that might be struggling taking this measurement and give you a path forward. I think starting with a neck tension of 1/1000th of an inch under the projectile diameter is where I'm going to be taking my measurements for jam, at least as long as I'm not running neck tension any less than that. In case you're not familiar, I did a video on these 21st century mandrels. You can check out that video where I cover them in more depth in the card right here. If you'd like to pick up the whole kit, or you can order them individually, I'm going to put a link to where you can find them on their website in the description box below. If you've had any problems with this process and found a way to work around them, I encourage you to leave those in the comment section below. Help our community out. Check out these other videos that YouTube thinks you're going to enjoy. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the results in next week's video. I hope to see you come back next week. And until then, stay safe in small groups.